Thank you so much. You listen way better than my kids do. My name is Jared Monshine. I am the Director of Research at the U.S. Studies Center based at the University of Sydney. Thanks for coming to this public event. We are going to have a panel discussion on the future of the Quad with a distinguished panel. But before we get that panel started, I want to first just give you a bit about what we just did today and why some of us may look more tired than others. We just had a whole day track 1.5 on the same topic as this event, the future of the Quad, and we talked about a wide range of topics, and we do what we really do best as a think tank, and we try to throw some ideas at the wall, contest those ideas, and think about how to move forward from here. And it was quite exciting because this is something that think tanks eat for breakfast. We love this sort of stuff. And this is something that I think in many ways think tanks are unique in being able to do, to get government officials, non-government officials, academics, think tanks, nerds like myself in one room and think about how to move forward from here. And so we wanted to not just keep it to ourselves, but actually to share some of the insights, not only from the day, but more broadly from some of the distinguished participants of today's Track 1.5, and to have a public event. Now, to have this discussion, it's going to be moderated by one of our favorite members of the media, Matthew Knott, who writes for the Sydney Morning Herald, and who is truly, I'm not just being nice to him because he agreed to join us. I really do mean he's one of my favorite members of the media because he really writes with a level of sophistication and nuance that is rare in too many members of the media, unfortunately. And he is going to be joined by a distinguished panel, including my boss, USSC CEO Michael Green, and who was actually at the birth of the Quad as we know it when he was working in the White House. And then we also have the Director of Foreign Policy and Defense, Dr. Lavina Lee, who recently joined the U.S. Studies Center from Macquarie University. And then we have the Center for Strategic and International Studies Senior Advisor and Australia Chair, Dr. Charles Adell, who formerly was on the Policy Planning Committee, Policy Planning at the State Department, but more relevant to me, worked with me at the U.S. Studies Center not too long ago. And then we have the Observer Research Foundation America Executive Director, Dhruva Jaishankar, who just happened to be in Australia for today's events, and we're so glad he could join us. And so without further ado, I'll let the distinguished panel join us. And for everyone to know, this is going to be recorded. So I appreciate you keeping it family friendly.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Oh, great. I'll have to cut out the swearing that I planned. But thanks all for being here, and I hope those of you who participated had a good day. I hope if you weren't in the room, know that you weren't alone. Journalists like me weren't allowed in there, which is always the sign that there's something interesting happening, something that gets us intrigued. So thanks to everyone for being here. I think it's a good time to have this conversation. Journalists like myself who cover foreign affairs, we write a fair bit about the Quad, but to be honest, there's a lot of focus really on, to be honest, the logistics of this grouping and whether there are going to be meetings or whether there aren't going to be meetings and where they're going to be. And a lot of the substance probably gets lost in that. So it's good to have a group of experts here. And so I was wondering, just working down the line, if perhaps you could give us an insight of anything you took away from the conversations today. First, Charles.
Great, thanks very much, Matthew. Thanks very much, Mike, for inviting me back, having us all here together. So look, to spill all the beans, we solve the world's problems. This Track 1.5, which means government officials plus the think tank and academic community, are there to have pesky folks like us who used to be in government, are now outside government, kind of pushing, poking, and prodding a little bit as we try to get a little bit more creative. So without spilling the beans, Let me just say the contours of the conversation about what Quad looks like, what the national perspectives are on it right now, and what might be useful agendas for it as it moves forward was the theme of our discussions today. I'll just note a couple of things that I think came up recurrently and really interestingly in conversation. The first is, if we're honest about things, and those of us who were in government or outside of government feel like we can be liberated and say whatever we want on these things, that the Quad is simply imbued with tension. It is a collective of democracies, all with deep interests in the region, but there's a public face and there's a not quite as public face. The public face is providing public goods for the Indo-Pacific region, proving that democracies can deliver, proving that there are alternative vehicles to authoritarian governments. That's had many work streams over the years. That's the public face. The kind of leitmotif of that is the not-so-public face, which is China, which is this is the glue that holds all four nations together. This is what drives them forward. And sometimes when China acts really negatively, really badly, and throws their weight around, the Quad becomes even more essential. So I would say today that the tension, not only between public-facing and private-facing, but also the tension on a bunch of different areas came up to the fore in our conversation, including market mechanisms. You've heard a lot about critical minerals, how much all four of our economies need these, how much we don't have them because China has, in some ways, a stranglehold on these. And now we're trying to do something that is contrary to the market incentives, meaning it's really hard, because the market has been manipulated by China for so long. Figuring out what the output is to kind of drive critical minerals away from not only refinement in China, but to make sure that there's steady supply of them is challenging, but is also, I think, the brief of all four governments. I'd also note that on the security side of things, we've shied away in many ways from talking about the Quad as an explicit security mechanism, because that's not what the public leaders talk about. But if you look at the statements from the leaders over the past year, Quad has become more focused on things that are security-minded, maritime domain awareness, logistics. It's also, in many ways, the measure, security, by which Quad members are evaluated for their contribution to the Quad. So there are a number of tensions here. The other thing that came out to me, I think, in our discussions today was that, as I said, when China behaves negatively in the region, when it's more aggressive in the region, the Quad looks like a really useful mechanism, and governments want to glom onto it more. But what that means, how it can materialize, is oftentimes a little bit unclear. So I think the contours of our conversation today, in many ways, revolved around two areas, what more and what else can be done in the security space and whether or not that's useful, and what else and what more can be done in the economic space. Because how do you solve a problem like economic coercion is really, really challenging. And figuring out everything from supply chains to critical minerals to subsea cables to semiconductors, and how our governments both work together to provide public goods and also provide for our own citizens is, I think, the tension. So don't worry, you missed a ton, but it was a really good conversation that teed up the agenda moving forward, Matthew.
I guess we could get into later the idea of whether one member of the Quad has been using economic coercion against some of the others.
Yeah, we're in public. Don't be shy about it. We can talk about that too.
We'll get into that. Lavina?
I think the tenor of the conversation today was about how do we progress the Quad. So the Quad was reconstituted in 2017. I think the general public narrative, which I think is quite correct, was that the four countries were really drawn together by what China was doing in our region, and how could we as democracies, capable democracies, what could we do together to effectively counter that? Now, I think the Quad has been seen to have lost its way a little. We talk about the number of working groups. There's a huge agenda for the Quad. And people were starting to ask questions, including experts like us. Where is the Quad going? There's 15 working groups. What is the focus? What is the rationale behind the Quad? So I think during the Biden era, I think it was a period where we had COVID-19. I think one of the main objectives at that point in time was to position the Quad as a less kind of strategic organization that was there to essentially provide public goods. So it was a positive force for good in the region, and there's nothing wrong with that. So the questions that we had today, I think for me, the organizing principles are, what do we want the Quad to be? So is it a mechanism for providing public goods, to be showing that democracies contribute to the region and contribute positively to the region in perhaps ways that China does not? Is it a strategic signaling device? So is it a means by which we try and coordinate our efforts to perhaps compete with China in the various ways in which it is undermining our interests? And I think the third one, which Charlie has alluded to, is that China initially was very against the Quad. It was very against the Quad because it thought that the Quad was the precursor to an Asian NATO. And you'll see now in its strategic narratives that it continues to call the Quad as an Asian NATO that is there to effectively disrupt and to cause problems for the region, to deflect from the fact that China might be the instigator of a lot of this. But we have to ask ourselves the question, do we want the Quad to be a more hard-hitting strategic device where we actually coordinate our militaries in some way? So I would put it in those three categories. What do we want the Quad to be? Perhaps we tick more than one box, but at the moment we are doing, I think, too much, and it was a good thing to see that the agenda was narrowed quite considerably last year.
Yeah, thank you. You just reminded me, I was in Washington in 2021 covering the US then, and that's when the first leaders meeting was held there, and Scott Morrison came over in the COVID times, and it was a big deal. Like, I think it was seen as a big deal at that time to have the Australian leader on par with these really big countries, and there was a lot of excitement about it. And of course, last year there was no meeting, and just in terms of that potential that was there, it wasn't that long ago, but it was a big deal for us to be a part of it. Drew, if you could talk.
I mean, just to rewind a little bit, particularly for a general audience who, like a lot of us, don't follow this on a day-to-day, meeting to meeting, reading boring statements issued by governments level. The Quad was first convened between the governments in 2007. There's some precursors to it, and Dr. Green was actually involved in that. I think he can speak to that. In 2007, 2008, we had the four governments meeting officially and also doing military exercises together for the first time. And then you had a decade-long hiatus. We can get into why and how that happened. In 2017, under the first Trump administration, the four countries started meeting again. Not coincidentally, it was after border tensions between India and China in the summer of 2017. That then led to a foreign ministers meeting, which took place on a regular basis, which was really a coordination mechanism where the four foreign ministers talked about China and other matters in the Indo-Pacific. Very soon after the Biden administration came in, they elevated this to a summit-level meeting and gave the Quad a structure, which is a bunch of initially 3 working groups, which then proliferated over the course of the 4 years of the Biden administration into a very large number of working groups. You had a restart of quadrilateral military exercises, and a whole bunch of other like add-ons that came Quad plus groupings, Quad minus groupings. It became a sort of pretty unwieldy beast. Then the reason I think we're talking about this is while one of the first actions of the second Trump administration was to hold a meeting of the foreign ministers of the Quad. It was, in fact, the first thing that Marco Rubio did as Secretary of State after his confirmation was go straight into a Quad meeting with his counterparts. The fact is we haven't had a summit-level meeting for over a year and a half. The last one was hosted by the United States in Delaware. And that has led to a lot of commentary about, does the Quad have a future? What is it doing? And yet, despite that, over the last year, and I'm just going to quickly just summarize, we've had 2 foreign ministers meetings over the last 13 months or so. The ambassadors of the Quad countries meet regularly, including in Beijing. We had a new critical mineral initiative announced in July. You have a ports initiative that was started and implemented, a coordination around humanitarian assistance in Myanmar. You had a humanitarian assistance tabletop exercise, a Quad counterterrorism working group meeting in December last year, an Indo-Pacific logistics network that Charlie mentioned. The 4 countries' navies did an exercise in November. They have just continued to implement an open telecommunications network in Palau, and have also implemented a maritime domain awareness network. So all I'm saying is, like, this has all happened in a year where the Quad leaders haven't met, right? This is a bad year for the Quad. And so if this is the sum and substance of what's happening in a bad year, that only shows that, you know, once the leaders start meeting, more things can come online. The Trump administration has focused the Quad's agenda on 4 key areas. These are maritime security, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, critical and emerging technologies, and economic security. And that perhaps makes sense. In some ways, a lot of the work that the Quad is doing could be put into those 4 baskets. So I think where we're at right now is, I think mostly the summit was held back because of differences between the United States and India over trade and tariff issues. That looks like it is now being resolved. We may actually have an interim trade agreement in March, in the next month, perhaps shortly after that. And that'll pave the way for, in some ways, a resumption of high-level political contact. So we may yet see a Quad summit on the horizon. India is expected to host the next one, followed by Japan. It could be later this year or early next year. So that, I think, is just where we're at. And I think it offers a good moment for us to have the kind of conversation that we had today, which is a little bit of a brainstorming session on what has worked so far, what should the Quad be doing in the future, and in some ways how we can make the most of this effort.
Your job is to ask questions so we can make good points, but you just made a really good point. So I want to pick up on your point about the summit in 2021 in Washington when Scott Morrison traveled. And I remember that one well because they had to sit about 50 feet apart from each other.
Yes.
So it was a little clunky. But what a great deal for Australia when you think about it. Australia is not in the G7. Should be, but it's not in the G7. It's not in the Security Council as a permanent member. But here, the Scott Morrison, and the first thing Anthony Albanese did after getting elected was fly to Tokyo for a leader summit. Sitting at the table with the leader of 1.4 billion people in India, the American president sitting atop the world's largest economy and military, and the Japanese prime minister, the 3rd largest economy in the world, and the major maritime power in East Asia. So what a great opportunity for Australia when you think of it that way. As you mentioned, I was in the White House in 2004 on Boxing Day when the tsunami hit the Indian Ocean, and the Quad was sort of conceived and started in the middle of a crisis, not with some long-term institutional concept. And what happened was the commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet, Admiral Walt Duran, was on board his flagship, the USS Blue Ridge, with a task force in the Indian Ocean. I imagine they felt the ocean kind of go up. He was home ported in Yokosuka, Japan. He was close friends with the head of the Royal Australian Navy. And he had gone to Command and Staff College, I think in Chennai, in the Indian Navy staff. So he knew everybody. So he just quickly sort of tested his counterparts, came back to the Pentagon and then to the White House and the State Department and said, hey, we think we can do a quadrilateral joint task force and we can do it now. And the decision it helped that it was the week between Christmas and New Year's because nobody was in Washington. So it was very quick decision making, I have to say. But it took about 12 hours for the 4 governments at the highest levels to say, let's do it. And what that showed us was there's a natural affinity and alignment for these 4 maritime powers. The US, Japan, US, Australia have treaties, but the US, Japan, Australia trilateral was fairly new, and India wasn't in any of it. But it just happened quite naturally. And as you've heard, there were 2 dimensions, saving thousands of people. In Banda Aceh, the TNI, the Indonesian military, could not get to Banda Aceh to help people, but American, Australian, Japanese helicopters could. in Sri Lanka, in Phuket, across the region, saving lives, delivering public goods, setting up medical facilities, public goods. But underneath it all, everyone had in mind the geopolitical signal of these four powerful maritime nations operating so smoothly together. So it's always had this, I don't want to say schizophrenic because they're not mutually exclusive, but it's had these two dimensions to it, the Quad. Delivering public goods for the region, showing democracies can deliver, and sending a geopolitical signal of the ability of these big maritime powers to work together if forced to. Since then, the Quad waxed and waned, as you've heard. It was on again, it was off again. Some governments liked it, some didn't. Pretty much every one of the four countries had a government at one point who wasn't so sure. But Prime Minister Abe of Japan pushed hard for it when he came back to power in 2012.
The Quad father.
The Quad father, I like it. The Trump administration and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State and others embraced it. India found religion, so to speak, after Daklan. Australia saw the utility. I think one of the key takeaways today for all of us was, while the public-facing activities of the Quad in terms of summit meetings and so forth come and go, the underlying bipartisan consensus in all four countries is very strong. And we do surveys at the U.S. Study Center of the four countries, and in our survey last year, about half of the population in all four countries said they would actually support the Quad becoming a formal military alliance. And opposition to that was quite small. People worry about, well, if we overdo it, won't we upset Southeast Asia? The Institute for Southeast Asian Studies asked last year whether the Quad was helpful to Southeast Asia, and about half across Southeast Asia said yes. And the no was 9%, was much smaller. And when you open it up, in the frontline states under pressure from China, Vietnam and the Philippines, support for the Quad was very high. So it's hard to be in government. I've worked in the Pentagon, I've worked in the White House. It's hard to schedule meetings, it's hard to get joint statements, it's hard to deliver on promises, but there is a political and geopolitical logic to this now, where I don't think we'll be talking about the demise of the Quad again.
Interesting. Dhruva, could I ask you, I think objectively, India is the most fascinating component of the Quad in terms of the way it works, just because of the relationships it has with other countries. It's also a member of BRICS, for example, and has developed ties with China. It has a long-standing defense relationship with Russia. It's tried to keep a balanced relationship with great powers, which is different to, say, a country like Australia, which is a formal alliance partner with the US. And then last year, we saw this trade war flare up between India and the US, really because of actions that Donald Trump took. I was wondering if you could explain a bit to us about the reaction that caused in India. We've seen a lot of discussion recently, say, about Europe and the way that Europeans have felt shocked by the way that Trump has behaved towards them. But we don't hear as much about India. Like, as you say, there's been signs that the trade dispute will be resolved, but is that going to leave a legacy of a lack of trust there, if you give the Indian perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe one way of thinking of it is there are some structural conditions and there are political conditions. The structural conditions is that India has a superpower growing on its doorstep for perhaps the first time in its history, independent history at least, right, which is China. And while India's rise has been pretty impressive over the past 30 years, China's rise has been much more. The Chinese economy today is almost 5 times the size of the Indian economy. That has presented opportunities, as it has for Australia and others, but it has also posed a security threat. India and China have a major boundary dispute, land boundary dispute. I mean, it's over quite a sizable amount of territory. India has a trade deficit with China of $100 billion a year. So it's a very unequal economic relationship. China supports, China has a security profile in the Indian Ocean that is of concern to India. And on multilateral issues in many areas, China and India do not see eye to eye. And so China's rise has not been accompanied by, it's been accompanied by a rising threat perception in India. That has, again, it's waxed and waned over time. We had periods which were relatively relatively stable and good. We've also had a series, particularly after 2013, a series of crises on the border, culminating in 2020, which actually led to the loss of lives on both sides. So I think that threat perception of China and how it is now informing almost every aspect of Indian policy, not just defense and security policy, economic policy, technology policy. So despite that relationship with China, in some ways, from a policy point of view, India has done more, perhaps than any other major economy, to decouple from China. India banned apps. It has removed eliminated Chinese companies from public procurement. For a while, until about a year ago, there were no direct flights between India and China. There were no journalists in each other's countries. So it was now the trade deficit has persisted. There are many reasons for that, and I can get into that. It's something that many other countries are sharing. But this has actually informed India's approach to much of the rest of the world, most noticeably with the United States. And so for the last 25 years, from 1999, 2000, we've seen a steadily improving relationship between India and the United States. Again, probably informing almost every aspect of policy. The largest Indian diaspora is in the United States, 5 million people. The largest export destination for Indian exports is the United States. The largest investment destination outside of some places where investment is round trip is the United States. So technologically, it is US tech companies that are the most important for India. So that we've seen over 25 years a steadily improving relationship, which has persisted regardless of administration in the United States. Republicans, Democrats, the first Trump administration, it steadily improved. What I think changed recently was we saw last May some differences emerge between India and the United States, mostly on this question of American mediation between India and Pakistan. And that in turn informed the trade negotiations that were underway, and that was complicated by India's purchases of Russian oil and US decisions to levy tariffs against India for that. These issues seem to be close to being resolved, particularly the trade issues, but it has led to a downturn in opinion of the United States and questions in India about how much India can trust the United States. To give one proxy of this, there's been a 25% drop in Indian students coming to the United States in 2025 compared to 2024 because of anti-immigration sentiment and other things. So I'm not going to say it doesn't have a role to play. It will lead to more doubts. But I think we've seen at the same time steadily continuing defense relationships. Actually, in October last year, India and the US signed a defense framework agreement. They held the Malabar exercises. There have been major AI investments into India. There have been major energy deals. So in some ways, the structure of that relationship has continued. It's actually proved more resilient than many people feared. But I do think it has led to political doubts about the United States.
Just to follow up quickly, could I ask, how do you think Prime Minister Modi has seen this? I mean, I think for a while he was really being courted by leaders around the world. He came to Australia and Anthony Albanese called him the boss at a big stadium gathering here. Joe Biden was really courting him. There was a view, like, with everything going on in India, essentially that it's not worth criticizing. We've got a bigger game that we're playing here with China, and he got along well with Trump in the first term. How do you think he's seen the way that Trump went about their relationship?
I mean, I do think it led to a period between May of last year and September where the two leaders didn't talk to each other on the phone. Between September and December, they spoke 4 times, and then there was a breakthrough came just a few weeks ago on a phone call where they agreed to a trade agreement. They haven't met now. So, in February last year, they met. They actually had a pretty successful bilateral meeting, a pretty rich statement, and quite ambitious objectives. So it really has gone downhill since between May and late last year. I do think it sort of affected the level of trust at the presidential level. But again, we've seen pretty consistent relationships. And over the past year, it's been interesting to see members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats in the U.S., say, we need to get India relations back on track and stuff. So I think again the superstructure remains, but I do think we're dealing in a world where we have big personalities, and that matters.
Yeah, speaking of big personalities, Charles, I was watching most of...
Thank you.
No,
you're not talking about
yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, including you. Maybe a bigger one is Donald Trump, but he had his State of the Union today. I saw most of it, not all of it, because it was extremely long. But I didn't hear him mention the Quad. I was wondering if you could say, do you think this is really on his personal radar at all as an important grouping? We've seen he really likes unilateral actions, personal kind of one-on-one relationships with other leaders, using leverage against other nations. What's in the Quad for someone like Trump in the way he sees the world? Or is it just a matter of bureaucrats beneath him or people like Marco Rubio using it to their own advantage?
Yeah, so I think there's more than one purpose going on here. So you didn't hear the Quad mentioned during the State of the Union, but my guess is, and we were all huddled and
Yes.
secluded, so we didn't hear it either, but my guess is you didn't hear about many other organizations, multilaterals, minilaterals. So the Quad doesn't suffer in comparison from that.
Maybe the Board of Peace.
Except
Yeah.
potentially the Board of Peace. There you go. So look, what's in it for Trump? First of all, Trump, I think, as things get back on track with India, will, I think, rightfully claim some credit for the Quad being revived while he was president the first time around. It wasn't necessarily his impetus, but he drove it forward and then accelerated under Biden. Now, that's a little bit different from our bureaucracy, our departments, our agencies that do the day-to-day work of this. So it turns out that in addition to what we've been talking about, the public goods that are provided, the smiley face, the positive, and the more negative, scowly face, the hard-edged security side of things, there are a couple of purposes that the Quad serves from a U.S. perspective, which I think he is cognizant of whether or not he's tracking it every day. So first and foremost, allies and partners. The United States, particularly this administration with a Trump face on it, is really into the tough love of allies and partners, sometimes minus the love component, right? They're just tough on allies and partners because they think that the security settings have changed. They think, from Donald Trump's perspective, that America has been paying too much of the burden of these arrangements. If you note, and we've already discussed this, that Marco Rubio was first out of the gate to hold a meeting on the very first day the Trump administration was in office with his three counterparts. That's a high priority agenda. So even if we talk about the tough love to allies and partners, there is a signaling mechanism that this one matters, and not all is as bad as it looks. A second part, which I think is almost by happenstance, is when there is political turbulence or friction between nations. Dhruva's just been talking this one through. If we think about the institutional way that the Quad has developed really over the past decade or so, hundreds of meetings at the working level, dozens of different working groups, ministerials, leaders meetings too, what that does is begins to build in some resilience for when there is friction, so it allows you to hook back in. I don't think this is by conscious design of Donald Trump, but because the officials meet so much, it actually has that too, to help there be resilience. And then the third part of this, I think, and what is the desire from an American perspective of this, if you look at the slate of announcements that's come out from Washington, most recently say take critical minerals. I'm not going to talk about Board of Peace, we'll talk about critical minerals. The entire impetus is to create a mechanism that is not held hostage to China's whims and desires. And the Quad is an arena, is a platform that allows the four countries to play in that. As we said, this is very much work in progress. It's contrary to market forces because of market manipulation by the Chinese. But if we think about what is the purpose for the United States, there's a personal one. He gets to shine when he's with leaders. He gets to talk. We know he likes doing both of those things. But also, it has a strategic objective. It has institutional resilience that it's built in, and it does allow the United States to, for the structural regions that have been described, continue progressing what is very much in the U.S. strategic interest.
Mike Green, for those who don't know, as well as leading the United States Study Center, is a world expert on Japan and Japanese politics. I was wondering if you could give a bit of a view of how Japan would be seeing the Quad right now. Particularly, we've just seen the really thumping election of Sanae Takaichi, and Japan seems to have right now a very strong leader, someone who Trump clearly respects as well. And I was wondering what the implications that will be for the Quad.
So, Takeichi-san has a 2/3 supermajority in the Diet. So she's got one of the best mandates of any political leader in the world right now, in a democracy anyway.
Is that more than Albanese even? Yeah.
It's more than Albanese even. And the Economist called her the most powerful woman in the world. She's the most powerful woman in Japan ever. Maybe, well, somebody pointed out to me the Empress Gensho in the 8th century might have been more powerful, but we're not sure. What's she going to do with her mandate? She's going to double down on the alliance with the U.S. and the Quad. Her mentor, Abe Shinzo, was a champion of the Quad. He called it the security diamond. He, not out of some nostalgia or not even really ideology, although some people accused him of being a neocon and trying to create this values-based alliance, but just math, or maths. Just the correlation of forces. Japan facing China in the East China Sea, could not handle it alone, needed the U.S., but the U.S. Needed help too. And so in international relations theory, when you face a rising challenge, theoretically you can do what's called bandwagoning and say, okay, Beijing, you're in charge now, not in Japan's national character or Australia's or India's. You can do internal balancing, it's called, where you just build up your own military power, but Japan's got limits, aging society, debt. Or you do what's called external balancing. You make friends and you strengthen those friendships. And that's just an absolutely core part of Japan's strategy. India's part of it. Australia's a very, very central part of it. But the US too. It's not that Donald Trump likes Takeichi. He sees her as kind of a Maloney of Asia, a sort of MAGA-like character, which is not quite right, although she doesn't disabuse him of that. But the Japanese public doesn't particularly like Donald Trump. You mentioned, Dhruva, in India, trust in the U.S. has gone down. In Japan, in Sankei Shimbun polls recently, 22% of the Japanese public say they trust the U.S. right now, which is the lowest ever. In Australia, in Lowy's poll, it's 35%, the lowest ever. In Australia's Lowy poll, 80% of Australians support the alliance, what it was 2 years ago. In Japan, in government polls of the public, support for the alliance with the U.S. has gone from 89% 2 years ago to 93% today. So you have this weird situation where people are anxious about and don't quite trust the U.S. right now, but the U.S. is indispensable. And I think there's some other explanations for this as well. Charlie mentioned the institutional relationship. If you sort of peel open the defense relations or business-to-business relations of the U.S. and Australia, U.S., Japan, India, they're very, very good. The defense relations have actually probably never been closer for any of these relationships, bilaterally, trilaterally, or quadrilaterally. That gives some confidence. In the U.S.-India case, President Trump wanted, it's not a big secret, he wanted Prime Minister Modi to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize for solving the conflict with Pakistan, which is pretty much a death wish for any Indian politician, can't do it. So, a problem. But the Indian diaspora is an incredibly powerful glue in America's relationship with India. The India Caucus in the US Congress is the largest political grouping for a diaspora group other than AIPAC, the American Israel Political Action Committee. When Prime Minister Modi went to the US in the first Trump administration, he went to Texas, which is full of Gujaratis, and did a huge Howdy Modi conference to 40 or 50,000 people. When he came here, what did he do? Went to Parramatta, good day Modi. I don't know what the numbers were, but it was 10s, 20,000. So I think also in Australia, the diaspora is a real glue. So there's a lot of sort of geopolitical, political, institutional buffers, because it's not that Donald Trump doesn't like Modi. I think he does like Modi. He likes Takeichi. He seems to get on with Prime Minister Albanese, but he just sort of changes his mind all the time. He's always looking for leverage. It's deeply anxiety-producing. You should live in Washington right now. But there's a structure and institutional relationship and a geopolitical logic that I think just keeps this moving forward.
Lavina, I was wondering if you could say for, I guess, the smallest member of the Quad, what's at stake specifically for Australia, and how big a priority should the Quad be for Australia? I think there's been a bit of a debate, say, with the way Albanese goes about his relationship with Trump. Should he be pursuing a kind of narrow agenda about not having tariffs, about AUKUS and projects like that, or should he be pursuing something bigger in terms of shaping the way the US sees the Indo-Pacific? So I don't know if you could give an Australia perspective.
Yeah, look, I think maybe I'd start with going back to what you asked Charlie, which was what's the direction, or what would the Quad mean for the United States under a Trump administration? I would also just point to, if you look at the way the Trump administration values alliances, as you said, it was tough love more than positive.
More tough than love.
More tough than love. He really measures alliances according to how much they contribute to capability. So in combination, when he looks at NATO, he says he sees free riding. He sees a lack of burden sharing. So I think that the Trump administration, or I should say President Trump, would look at the Quad and measure the Quad according to those same measurements. So how much does it contribute to or amplify American power in combination with others? So I think the narrowing of the agenda for the Quad, I expected that when the Trump administration came to be, because I think it will look at what are the hard power deliverables that the Quad can achieve. And it does look at institutions as potential burdens, and that it views, if you read the US National Security Strategy, it says very clearly, America will not be the world's policeman. America will not be the provider of public goods in perpetuity. So we are not taking that burden on. So it will look at the Quad and the Quad members in terms of how does this grouping actually share the burden, but also provide some kind of hard power benefits to the United States. So I'm a director of a foreign policy and defense program. So when I look at the Quad, I still see, if we're thinking about where should the Quad go from here, I do actually think, yes, the Quad has been able to achieve a lot in the military security space, but there's a lot more that could be focused on. So your question was Australia, how should Australia position itself within the Quad? I think we go back to the first meeting between Albanese and Trump in the White House. That was all about critical minerals. So in terms of the Quad agenda, if I was Albanese, I would be talking about areas of strength, comparative advantage that Australia has that we can amplify within a Quad structure. So it would be critical minerals. It would be our strengths in the Pacific on things like critical infrastructure. We could work with other countries on port development in combination. The other things that came up today that I think really need to be focused on is undersea cables and the deep vulnerabilities that we have in undersea cables. And this, I think, is more difficult, but I think we should be thinking about military and security matters. The difficulty with the Quad is that we have 4 countries with threat perception of China, but yet maybe not the same commitment to the kinds of conflicts that we might see going forward. So India is really the biggest outlier when it comes to things like a Taiwan conflict or a South China Sea conflict. But that's not to say that the Quad could not contribute to general deterrence. So the enabling foundations for working together in a military sense. And I can speak more about what I mean by that later.
I'd like you to. When you're speaking before about the way China views the Quad, and it's spoken about it being a mini NATO in Asia, there have actually been people, I was speaking last week to Eli Ratner, who was a former senior official in the Biden administration, who said that this other grouping, which has been nicknamed the Squad, which is essentially the Japan, US, Australia, but the Philippines instead of India, that they should be pursuing a formal defense alliance, that there's such a shared perspective on the threat of China and on the world, much more so than with India, and that essentially that should be the top priority. How do you compare the two?
Look, I think the Philippines is very important. So I wouldn't say either or. I would say further defense and security relations with the Philippines, specifically because the Philippines, under its new president, is much more aligned on China than previous government. So the Philippines has now enabled the United States to use more of its bases and to pre-position forces, munitions in the Philippines, which be extremely important in a Taiwan contingency. I think it's important for the Philippines we can help them become more capable. So the more capable they are, the more they can add to the strategic balance. But coming back to India, and I know Dhruva will not disagree with me, we should, yes, the Squad, but I think India really is very important. Even in a Taiwan contingency, I just said that Taiwan won't factor strongly for India. It's not its highest priority. But yet, that complication of having India within the Quad being still the most significant Indian Ocean military power does give China pause in a potentially protracted conflict. What could India actually contribute in a protracted conflict? Could it be defense industrial production? Could it be military action around choke points? Could it be access, overflight, and basing that would allow power projection? So all of those things, I think, make India extremely important, and I wouldn't want the Quad to be downplayed in that way.
Dhruva, could I ask you, like Lavina, you've also argued in Foreign Affairs, that the Quad needs a harder edge. For the Quad in general, but also specifically for a country like India that doesn't really like formal alliances with other countries, how much could realistically be done in a security sense between the four nations? What could we feasibly see them doing together?
So, I mean, the short answer is a lot, but let me just give you some context. The United States has not entered into a new mutual defense treaty alliance since 1960, which was when the Japan treaty was finalized, barring NATO expansion. So we recently had Sweden and Finland, for example, joining NATO. This was ratified by the US Congress. They're now treaty allies. The US, particularly under Trump, but I think there's a growing bipartisan consensus about this in the US as well, isn't in the business of doing more mutual defense treaty alliances. In fact, they're trying to, in some ways, water down some of their existing commitments. So with India, I think the prospect of that is remote, nor is it something India wants. India doesn't want military aid from the US, it doesn't want bases, it doesn't want troops, it doesn't want a nuclear umbrella, it doesn't want a mutual defense treaty alliance. So now, if you take that aside, that sort of the formal structures of a treaty alliance, a lot is possible. So a far greater interoperability, defense industrial production, intelligence sharing, domain awareness. So I think you can constantly push the bounds, but I think there's a general understanding that those things that I mentioned are, unlike the U.S.-Japan treaty, the U.S.-Australia arrangements, U.S.-South Korea, U.S.-Philippines, which are all, again, these are all treaty allies. India doesn't really sort of seek that, but there is a lot that can be done short of that. And in fact, I think if we look back, the militaries are doing things today that we did not think were possible 5 or 10 years ago. Indian shipyards are repairing U.S. Navy ships. India and Australia are doing air-to-air refueling. We're doing anti-submarine warfare exercises. So things that are quite, again, are very much out of India's traditional comfort zone. But even Australia and Japan don't do this with many countries outside the United States. So I think the situation is evolving. It responds more to external crises. In fact, maybe Abe is not the Quad father. Maybe Xi Jinping is. Yeah. So it is that external, those external factors that drive the pace of that cooperation.
Charles and maybe Mike too, if you're keen to weigh in. What would you expect to see from the Quad this year, and particularly, would you expect to see? Would Trump be willing to go to India for a meeting? Would you expect him to be engaged, also considering there are midterm elections this year in the US? There's often We've seen in the past debt crises and negotiations have got in the way of this grouping. What would you expect to see?
Yeah, the illusion that Matthew just made is I have a collectible. It's a quad pen in Sydney.
I want one of those.
Where the opera house is on the pen. I say it's a collectible because, of course, that did not happen. That is, there was supposed to be a Quad leaders meeting here, and once again, the United States was about to drive itself over a fiscal cliff, so the president couldn't come because he had to make sure that that was okay. Look, in terms of what to expect moving forward, I think the political factors matter here because this is an important year in American domestic politics, with the primaries coming up in the House races and the Senate races really between May and June, and then the midterm elections in November. In general, the signals that I hear from those in and around the orbit of the White House are do not expect a lot of overseas travel this year. He's done that. He even flew out at the beginning of this year, but now it's domestically focused, but it's Donald Trump. So it's hard to say expect a lot of attention on one thing when any given day we'll see a lot of attention on other things, namely, for instance, Iran overseas at this point. So I would say the work between our State Department, DFAT, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will continue apace. I would expect to see a ministerial level meeting. I'm not quite sure at the higher level. But when you step back a second about what to expect, given kind of the strum and drang of our politics, I do think that the structural factor, which we keep talking about, otherwise known as the strategic factor, otherwise known as the China factor, is likely to persist. Which is to say, when I was living here in Sydney, when I was working at the U.S. Studies Center, I would go back to Washington all the time. I remember being in a room at the White House with a Trump official, and they asked me for my assessment of how things were landing in the region, U.S. policy under Trump. And I said, well, I think we've made a bunch of missteps, but thank goodness that China continues to be America's #1 ally. And I got excuse me? China is not an ally of the United States of America. And I said, yes, I think I know this part. The factor is that China continues to create the demand signal for America being deeply anchored into the region. And so what to expect, your question is, China has an awful lot of throw weight in the region. Its influence is growing in the region, and China is going to persist in pushing further south, further east, and further west as it continues to move into what we call the commanding heights of the 21st century economy. So what to expect is that will continue apace, and therefore anything of these, I don't want to say blips, but the politics around this and the politics of friction sometimes between leaders is ultimately going to be background to driving the strategic rationale between all four nations.
Mike, what would you say to him?
I mean, I think Charlie's right. The political calendar does not lend itself to presidential travel. But I think a foreign minister's meeting, Marco Rubio and so forth, is quite possible. I think the systems, all four governments will want to do that. The summits are useful. I mean, when Joe Biden sat down with Scott Morrison and, well, with Albanese as well, and with Modi, and then at the time with Suga and Ishiba, the content of the discussion was incredibly valuable. And it was not a scripted Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS meeting where people read statements in front of the cameras. It was hours over dinner talking about some of the things they put in the joint statement, Myanmar, Ukraine. And so it's a kind of lost opportunity if there isn't a summit, but the agenda doesn't freeze. The interesting question to me is what happens after the midterms. Typically, presidents focus on foreign policy when they lose badly in the midterms because they can't get their legislative agenda through domestically. So when, for example, Clinton got clobbered in the 1994 midterms, and over the next 2 years, he did NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, NATO expansion, finalized China's accession to the WTO, revitalized the U.S.-Japan alliance. It was a long list. I'm not sure if that logic applies because Donald Trump doesn't have a legislative agenda really. It's mostly executive orders and other things. So we'll have to see. But it is possible that sort of in the search for legacy, he does get more interested in the Quad. One important variable in all that will be his summit with Xi Jinping. The president clearly wants some kind of grand bargain on trade and so forth, and he has less leverage now because the Supreme Court ruled his IEEPA tariffs unconstitutional, so he's got less to threaten with. But Xi Jinping is not in the business of making other leaders feel validated and important. If you look at Google later, not right now because we're very important, but Google later Xi Jinping summit pictures, he always has the other person on this side so that he doesn't have to cross his arm. It's a very dismissive kind of gesture, and there will be military reviews and lots of pomp and circumstance, but Xi does not give good deals to other leaders. And so I think there's a 50-50 chance that this summit between Trump and Xi ends up being a bust. And then the president may be looking around for other sources of sort of foreign policy legacy and leverage. But Xi is Xi is the maybe most important variable in all of this. And I think to Charlie's point, the 15th Party Congress coming up is going to basically double down on what's called China Shock 3.0. Chinese companies will be told, if you're working on advanced technology, you can get a loan. So there's going to be massive overcapacity, huge backlash. The PLA military exercises, including around Australia, but especially around Taiwan and Japan and in the Indian Ocean, they are going to increase, not decrease. So I think all of this sort of points towards, if not the president, the Secretary of State and the foreign minister is moving this forward, but maybe the president, we'll see.
Yeah.
Actually, one thing I should just jump in on, there will be an opportunity for the four leaders to meet this year at the G20, which the United States is hosting in Miami. Trump is going to host this in Florida. So all four leaders are technically scheduled to be there. So maybe we'll have a Quad summit on the sidelines.
Possible.
Good point. We'll have time for any audience questions. I think also if you've got smart people here, if you have something you want to ask them in this terrain, would be good. If I could just ask you all, we'll go down the line. Yeah, say assuming a leaders meeting is happening, and we're at the start of the year now, would you have a big idea to improve the Quad and revitalize it in terms of, is there something you'd like to see at the top of the agenda list, a topic, or would you like to see the way it works be changed? Just something each of you could contribute.
I'll give you two.
Yeah. Okay.
Number one, it's important to lift ambitions. It really is, particularly as China promises the world. It's important to lift ambitions. If you don't deliver on those ambitions, it does the opposite of what your intention was. There have been a lot of announceables over the past 4 or 5 or 6 years. Some of them have been streamlined, but making sure that the checklist is actually filled out and we are delivering. I mean, that's a broad point, but I think it's a really necessary one. The second one, around critical minerals, around satellite data, around subsea cables, around semiconductors. Look, economic coercion is a wickedly difficult problem to solve. No country can do it on its own, especially when we're acting contrary to market forces, I keep saying, which have been manipulated by China. Figuring out what happens in the offsetting economic coercion space, maybe it's all 4 of these channels that I just described, but putting that agenda and moving it forward, because before we get to anything kinetic, violent, this is the main arena of strategic competition.
Lavina.
Okay, well, I would say critical minerals is right up there, and critical technologies like semiconductors and supply chains in that area. Going back to my defense theme, if I was to pick one, so I'd probably have 5. One that I would think, when we're doing work at the US Study Center, we're looking into how Japan and South Korea and Australia can work together in a much more concerted way. I think one of the great lessons for me from the Ukraine conflict is the lack of defense industrial production. So we really are in a very peace footing, but we need to be prepared for the potential of fighting wars into the future. but also that we deter conflicts by showing that we can fight protracted wars, if that makes sense. So if our adversaries think that we can't last, that we effectively will have to capitulate within 3 or 6 months, that is actually not sending any deterrent signal. So when we're doing work with countries like Japan and South Korea, we're looking at bolstering our cooperation on defense industrial production. So those are things like munitions, missile production, long-range strike missiles, which is all in our own interest as the Australian military will want to have greater self-reliance. But in this broader purpose of, I call it general deterrence, that ability to signal that you can fight protracted wars, I think defense industrial production is really up there. And as you see with Ukraine and Russia are burning through missiles, long-range strike missiles. And that is one of the reasons why the United States has been effectively so hard on the NATO countries, is that the United States' own stockpiles are diminishing, and hence it needs other countries to step up their defense industrial production. So that would be my pick for.
Great. Drew?
I'm sorry.
Oh, just what you'd want at the top of the agenda or an idea to improve the Quad.
I mean, I would second the defense industrial cooperation. The U.S. wants to see. There's a bit of a paradox here. The Trump administration wants to see countries buy American weapons, but they also want to see countries increase their own capabilities. There are some ways of doing both at the same time, but sometimes there's a bit of a paradox of short-term versus long-term effort there. But pooling those resources amongst not just the Quad countries, but other like-minded partners is going to be integral. I mean, this Korean defense companies now manufacturing in India and selling to third countries. This is again something we would not have been possible a little while ago. So there's a lot more that can be done in the defense industrial space. I think industry sectors that are where the natural laws of market economics do not work for a variety of reasons. Shipbuilding, critical minerals, legacy semiconductors. These are either very capital intensive or require off-take arrangements. So they require pooled capital, pooled risk. So these are, I'd say that's a second area that space cooperation is something we discussed today. My colleague Raji, who might be here, spoke very evocatively about sort of where the 4 countries can work a lot more in space. And all 4 countries have strengths, whether it's geographic strengths, launch capabilities, satellite making capabilities, because that's going to be the future. So those are just some of the areas that came up. I think there are probably a few more that come to mind.
I completely agree with the defense and security agenda that we just heard. And I think you'd agree with this, but from my perspective, the most important thing is not that we announce it at a summit, that we just do it. Mm-hmm. So it could flow from a foreign minister meeting. I'm not sure it has to be necessarily the headline from the summit. If we're doing everything that Lavina and Charlie and Dhruva said about defense industrial cooperation, maritime security, supporting the Philippines, the PLA will notice. The Philippines will notice. and it's sort of, I'm a Theodore Roosevelt guy. You speak softly, carry a big stick. If we have that stick, they'll notice. So I'm not sure that needs to be the headline, although smart reporters like yourself will figure it out. The headline I would want is we have each other's back. So right now, Xi Jinping does not like Takeichi at all. She made statements in the Diet that most Japanese would find quite accurate, that an attack on Taiwan would be a threat to Japan and Japan's survival. But after that statement, Beijing put massive economic boycotts and embargoes and export constraints on China that did not get a response from any of the other 3 leaders. Andrew Scheer, as Director of National Intelligence, said something. I think Marco Rubio said something. The headline I would want to see, if this is still going on, is we have your back, Japan. This is not right. So I think that leader level message is the one that matters the most. That you push one of us, we're all friends. You don't have to threaten. You don't have to. But just that signal to me would be the most important headline in the Sydney Morning Herald
Yeah.
after the article that I write analyzing.
Yeah, we didn't see Albanese and Penny Wong coming out with really strong comments.
Nor Trump.
Supportive.
And I'm pretty sure I didn't see Modi, but I could be wrong.
Not then, but he did visit Japan before going to China.
Yeah.
Takashi had just taken over perhaps by that. And then he has congratulated her on her victory and all that. But I'm not sure. I don't recall if he made a statement.
When Australia was, under embargo and pressure from China, I think Canberra didn't actually want a lot of collective response, and that's been true for other countries. But I think increasingly there's a recognition that if China's going to do that kind of economic embargo and coercion, there is real power in signaling that all of us see it and we're going to back each other up. Without being specific about what the consequences are, because actually it's quite difficult to figure out what we do. But nevertheless, I think the message is important.
Can we actually just underscore this point? The reason that Beijing has been so hostile consistently to the Quad is the same reason that Beijing is hostile to ASEAN kind of working as a group on issues pertaining to the South China Sea, is the same reason why Beijing is hostile to the Pacific Island Forum, working as a group to offset Chinese influence and interference in the Pacific. Beijing hates anything that has a whiff of the collective. Because if we think about sheer power dynamics, China can overawe any one country. But when you have more than one country saying the same thing, making sure that they have each other's back, it's much harder to point to the United States interfering in the domestic politics of Australia or India or Japan. That's the real underlying logic behind this and behind China's actions.
That's important to know. Does anyone have any questions? Do we have and we have a mic coming around.
So on the subject of Jersey Lee from Crow. So on the subject of one thing that could improve Quad, I'm just wondering that given that providing public goods is ostensibly what Quad is designed for, and most of these public goods would be provided to global South countries, but in the Quad, only India is obviously India says it's a leader of the global South, but I'm feeling that, shouldn't Quad, if it wants to provide these public goods, have more global South representation, whether a former member or some kind of other mechanism to signal that it is, serious about engaging with the global South, like competing with China on this front. And also quickly on what Charlie just said at the end, I just note that Trump and China both hate the collective. So I'm wondering what you think of that.
I can take the first part of that a little bit. I think, one of the challenges has been that when over the past 15 years or 20 years, China has offered seemingly attractive terms for loans for large infrastructure projects as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It has offered military equipment sometimes to states in the global South. It has offered certain goods. Now, with strings attached often, which is less often spoken about. And one of the challenges that came, whether it was India or the US or Japan sometimes, was when they were engaging these countries, they would say, where is your alternative? And so I think part of the logic behind the public goods was these were 4 countries that said, look, we have some capabilities. And we want, if a country in the global South asks, we should be able to collectively, maybe it's something India doesn't have, but India can coordinate with another country to provide that. And I'll give you a few examples where that's actually been done. Palau has asked for approach the United States and said, we want better telecommunications connectivity. And so working with Japan, Australia, and India, the United States has provided that. Cambodia and Vietnam and Thailand said during the height of the COVID pandemic, we want vaccines. And so, India and others, marshaled what resources together, coordinated, and provided extra vaccines. Cambodia and Thailand were the first 2 countries that provided that too. So those are just some examples where it was basically to have that answer, saying, okay, maybe India can provide something, but working with other countries, the Quad countries. So I think it comes down more to capabilities rather than anything else. Are there countries that offer, this is where I think the flexibility of the Quad is a strength. There are certain times where maybe there is a country, whether it's from the global South or not, that does have that capability to provide something. So during the pandemic, it now seems like ancient history, the Quad countries also worked with Israel, Brazil, other countries to actually coordinate some of the vaccine distributions in the global south. So again, I don't think we need to be too rigid about it. There are times when it makes sense, but I do think it comes down to there aren't too many countries that have excess capabilities in some of the areas we're talking about.
I'll take on that question. I disagree with the premise of your question. I don't think Trump hates the collective. I think Trump likes being center stage, number one. I don't think he hates the collective. I think he's been very clear and very consistent that he is into things, or institutional arrangements and otherwise, that amplify and grow American power. That's not mutually exclusive with collectives. And I don't think he's anti-collective. I think he's been saying since his first term in office that America is no longer going to play the role that it played before. He thinks it's because America's gotten a raw deal from this, but also because the world in 2026 does not look like what it did in 2016, does not look like what it did in 1989, doesn't even look like what it did in 1945. And America and its allies and partners have not kept up, and have not kept up especially with what China has done. And so anything that he can do to poke, to prod, I come back to that tough love thing, oftentimes minus the love, is to help rectify a global situation, a regional situation, a security environment that he thinks, and I think most observers would agree, has badly moved away from America and Australia's interests. And I would simply say that that's, for all the rhetoric and words you hear out of Donald Trump, that is not a view that is incompatible with how the Australian government sees things. And I would refer you over and over again to Penny Wong's referencing to Australia's national interest being to provide a favorable balance of power for the region. The operative word there is favorable, not balance of power. Australia wants it to yawn to Australia's side with the United States, with Japan, and with India as much as it can.
The structural factors are significant. As a percentage of GDP, the U.S. pays roughly twice what the vast majority of its allies pay on defense, about twice as much, and on social welfare, healthcare, and so forth, about half as much as most of our allies. So in our polling, when we asked the American public about this, consistently 2/3 say allies need to do more. And you can understand structurally why that would be something Trump would grab. Biden did too, Clinton did. They just weren't as noticeable, I guess. I'm trying to think of the right adjective. On the other hand,
Obama asked nicely.
Obama asked nicely.
Trump asked less nicely.
But at the same time, in our polls, in every poll that's out there, the American public overwhelmingly wants NATO, ANZUS, U.S., Japan, U.S., Korea. They want allies. The support for alliances in the Congress is very broad. You know, AOC on the left just gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference that was all about allies. Allies are popular on the left, on the right, and in the middle. But I do think Jersey's got a point. I mean, Donald Trump's negotiating style is not so different from Xi's, but that's not broadly how the public, the Congress, or most of his own cabinet views American interests. But I think the U.S. pays a bit of a price for it sometimes, as we did with Modi.
Anyone else? Oh, sorry, Lavina.
No, I just thought something we don't think about in terms of public goods. So we drew us right to talk about the vaccine initiative during COVID-19. That was a huge public good that we seem to have forgotten. COVID is in the past, but it was a horrible time for all of us. So that was an important contribution. The origins of the Quad were in humanitarian aid and disaster relief, and the Quad is furthering that type of agenda for public goods. I guess when we think of public goods, we should always remember that security and stability is a public good. So what the Quad can contribute to in terms of deterring major war, even if it's a latent capability, is actually a contribution to global public goods.
Maritime domain awareness is another good example, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
Gentleman in the front.
Do you want, there's a mic, yeah, somewhere.
Instead of having the Quad of 4, could you have the Group of 5? In other words, you included the Philippines in there, because it'd be a nice strategic anchor in that part of the world. What are your thoughts?
I'll start with that. Look, countries have more than one types of relationship. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, and I don't think they should be married together. And the reason for that is the Quad's agenda, as we've been discussing, is really broad. It's across the entire Indo-Pacific region, which at the very least is 3 different distinct geographic regions. The list of public goods provided, we've gone down the list, falls into 4 buckets. There are lots of working groups. It's a broad agenda. The Squad, minus India plus the Philippines, is extraordinarily focused because the threat is so clear and present to them. It's geographically circumscribed in the South China Sea. It's all about security, and it's all about what they can do to coordinate on this. So I don't think there's any problem in sometimes having a Quad Plus where the Philippines might dock into the Quad on certain things, but these are different organizations with different intents and objectives. Again, one being much more geographically circumscribed with a very clear mission set, the other one being much broader in what it's trying to do.
And actually, the Quad countries have done usually one-off military exercises with sometimes a 5th country. So they did a few years ago a joint sail with the Philippines in the South China Sea. All 4 Quad navies participate. They've done a military exercise with France. They've done one with Canada, actually, I think, involved. So they have been one-off things where it happens to be, it's usually not branded a Quad exercise, but it happens to be these 4 countries plus sometimes a 5th or a 6th as well.
I'd say sorry.
So go ahead.
I'd say it's also about capability. So if you think about the Quad agenda, it's broader than military, even though I keep talking about the military aspects. But if it is about undersea cables and critical minerals, you have to think about the partners within it and what they can contribute to those particular problems. So I think a Squad, as Charlie said, is very much a specifically threat-related construct. And the Quad, as it has grown, has become much broader than just military and security, and it's got a wider agenda. And I don't think the Philippines can contribute to that wider agenda.
One of the, perhaps the main driver for the Quad, the response in 2004 was to the tsunami, but the strategic driver is that these are the 4 most influential maritime democracies in the Indo-Pacific at a time when the maritime domain is under incredible stress from the combination of Chinese military power, infrastructure financing, and so forth. If we get more worried than we are right now, there are some logical candidates to join this grouping. Korea would be high on the list, New Zealand, Canada, Philippines. We're not doing it. Why we're not doing it? Because we're not that scared yet. And if you start, all 4 Quad countries want stable relations with China. And if you start making the group too big and it starts looking like a NATO, you can almost create a self-fulfilling prophecy in the dynamics with Beijing. Now, if Beijing goes there first, then I would actually predict you do start seeing New Zealand, Canada, Korea, and others joining the Quad. But I don't think the Quad founding members want to go there because we are all trying, including the United States, to stabilize relations with Beijing to avoid self-fulfilling prophecy. But never say never. I mean, in some ways, the determination, as we keep saying, is kind of in Beijing about how much this thing grows into a more security-oriented organization.
We need to get Dhruva to the airport at 7, so maybe I'll take a couple more.
My flight's been delayed, so I have a bit of
Thank
time.
you, Qantas.
Yeah. This gentleman, maybe if we could get these 2, and then we can comment on whatever you'd like.
That's more.
My name's Justin Patey, Adams Raves Marsh & Co. At one of your previous meetings, I asked a question about India and its historic links with the Soviet Union and then Russia. It's still apparently buying Russian oil. President Trump has recently made remarks about pressuring it to stop buying Russian oil. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that aspect of what's going on? And for India to be a good member of the Quad, does it need to wean itself completely off its security links with Russia, because you were talking about defence preparedness and cooperation being something that the 4 members were going to be focusing on. How can India be focusing on that with the other 3 members if it's still got the links with Russia?
Yeah, happy to answer.
And could we get this question, and then if you could just keep that in mind.
Hi, David. Thank you very much for coming. My question is, though, is sort of looking back in history of Paul Keating and his criticism of the Quad and Australia's involvement. He said we should leave it because it's sort of provoking China. And I'm just saying, what do you say to people who are critical of our involvement in it? Sort of, just as a broad rule.
We all want to answer that one.
We all.
I'll leave it to you guys. I'm happy to take the question. Yeah, no, thank you. So briefly, I would say that today there are 3 aspects to the India-Russia relationship. And Russia, from India's point of view, unlike Europe, India doesn't have a sort of natural areas of competition with Russia, right? So now I think there is also a grave awareness that China and Russia are becoming close partners. And the February 4th, 2023 statement, where they said they would have a no-limits partnership, certainly resonated strongly in India. But even today, I think there are 3 aspects to the relationship. One is a legacy relationship encompassing defense, nuclear, and space and strategic technologies, mostly defense. And that has, over time, waned. Prior to 2014, prior to the Russian annexation of Crimea, over 80% of India's defense imports were coming from Russia. Now, over the past 5 years, it's about 36%. So that shows that there's been a gradual decline. And that's generally understood by the United States and as well, that they see the trend line. Even new orders are mostly new orders for legacy equipment, not new technologies. It's for a variety of reasons. It's not simply India's desire to wean itself off. I mean, that's part of it. There have been issues with payment because of sanctions. Obviously, Russia, because of the active war in Ukraine, has been prioritizing the Ukraine theater in deliveries rather than exports. So for a variety of reasons, mostly of Russia's doing, this is required India to both indigenize its defense industry, but also diversify to other partners, mostly to the benefit of France, the United States, Israel, Korea, UK, a few others. The second aspect of the relationship is an energy and commodity relationship, and that has grown after the war. So prior to the war in Ukraine, less than 3% of India's oil imports were coming from Russia, 0% of gas. Since then, it's swelled. Last year, there was 1 month where it was about 36% of India's oil imports. It has come down. It probably is likely to come down further, again, due to extraneous factors, including sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft that the United States imposed, and also more oil coming onto the global market, including from Venezuela, Guyana, United States, Brazil. So I think that is coming down. But I will say that remains important because these are globally traded commodities, energy being one of them, but also coal, diamonds, palladium, uranium, that are in short supply globally, and Russia happens to provide. And by the way, even the United States has created carve-outs on, say, uranium and palladium imports from Russia. The third aspect, again, I would expect it to come down, but this will remain subject to market forces. The third aspect is there's a strategic dimension to it, which is India's concerned about the proximity of the China-Russia relationship and the detrimental, how this would play out across Eurasia. And you see India continuing to try to engage Russia in a sort of positive way to ensure that relationship, or at least in some cases, Russia has an option that's not China, including, say, for example, investment in the Far East, the Russian Far East, in Central Asia, that it has another partner to work with. And so you'll see India continue for these reasons to engage with Russia diplomatically as well. But if you look at this trajectory, I think you have, so you have a declining strategic, defense relationship. You have a volatile energy and commodity relationship. And then you have this strategic tension because in some ways India's historical best friend is now partners with its now new competitor. So.
You want to speak to Paul Keating?
Well, I'll start the ball rolling. So I would say, in short, the critique that you offered via Paul Keating fundamentally reverses cause and effect. So there's a debate. Mike was talking earlier about Quad 1.0 and it's gone through kind of ebbs and flows. There's a debate in the strategic community who or what exactly killed Quad 1.0. But a large factor was clearly this critique that was in the water before Paul Keating made it, which was Beijing making the argument in 2007, 2008, 2009, that the more you get together, the more this evinces a Cold War mentality, and the more this shows China that we're encircled. And if you do this, you will prompt us to become more aggressive in our approach to the region and undertake a military modernization that allows us to compete with the four of you who are that much more advanced than we are. Now again, I'm not pointing fingers at who exactly was the principal author of the demise of Quad in its original conception,
Kevin Rudd.
but this argument resonated.
You'll be getting a long letter, I think, about that.
The point here is that the Quad came down and China did exactly what it said it was going to do if the Quad persisted. That is, it became much more aggressive in the region and undertook the largest military modernization we've seen in modern history, which is to say that in many ways, when Mike was in government, the Quad was an idea before its time. Now its time has clearly arrived because of the prompt and the impetus that China continues to send to all four capitals, would be my take.
The alternative that former Prime Minister Keating proposes is a security treaty between Australia and Indonesia. And the country in the world that is most perplexed by that proposal is Indonesia, because I teach in Jakarta from time to time to the government security forces and so forth, and Indonesia doesn't do that. Indonesia does not sign treaties with other countries to provide them security. So Indonesia is incredibly important for Australia, but it's not going to defend sea lanes. It's not going to stabilize the region. But I'd also say I'm glad he's in the game because it makes it much more entertaining and fun for everyone.
Last word, I agree with everybody, but I think also when you look at what Paul Keating says, the underlying message behind it or assumption is that an order in the Indo-Pacific dominated by China is not a bad thing. So I think we have to make our own choices about whether we would prefer that. And currently, that is not what I think most countries in this region would want. So the Quad, if it can play a role in maintaining that kind of favourable balance of power, I think it's playing a valuable role.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic, and I really appreciate the insightful comments from everyone. Those of you who may not know anything about us will maybe be wondering, including maybe Paul Keating, why is the U.S. Study Center doing something on the Quad? You may not realize this, but our middle name is actually, it's not just U.S. Study Center. Our middle name is Allies and Partners Center as well. And I think this is really something that means a lot to us. In addition, we also, thanks to Mike joining us a few years ago, we added to our motto. We were always doing analysis of America, insights for Australia, but he added solutions for the alliance. And increasingly, it's solutions for allies and partners too. And I think that really gets to the core of what we've been doing the last few years. And so we're really glad to have had such a distinguished panel and a fantastic discussion earlier today as well. With that, we are now done. Please stay here. We have networking here for the next few minutes because the Intercon is a lovely hotel and has the minimum spent. And so we have to do it somehow. So please enjoy yourself and bolster those Quad collections.
Support.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone.